But, and it's a big but, it's just one box now. So the way to liken this, and I'm sure any universities watching this will want to shoot me, is that imagine if you wanted to get a job for Pizza Hut doing deliveries. Well, you're going to need a driving license to be able to obviously get that job, to be able to do deliveries. That's how I'm kind of seeing university these days. Welcome back to the channel. In this video I want to talk about some preconceptions and misconceptions about university. I had quite a few questions and requests for my thoughts on university life and what I think about whether it's worth going to university or not. So what I want to do is basically address those misconceptions as we go through the video, and at the end I'll talk about actually my opinions on what I would do differently to what I did in the past. So let's jump into it. University gives me a competitive advantage. Yes and no. Like, two key points to look at here, or two bits of data you should be looking at here, is that of 18-year-olds leaving school or college, now between 25 and 30% of those are going straight into university. So it's a very, very big pool of people. The other key bit of data is that 18 to 30-year-olds, that figure crossed over 50% very recently for people participating in higher education. So it's an even bigger pool. So that basically covers that obviously people having a year out or deciding to go part-time maybe later on in life. So now we've got over half of the people in that age bracket attending higher education. So it's a huge pool of people. Now, one of the biggest advocates of university, outside of the media and obviously universities themselves, I think comes from actual parents. So what I think is an interesting fact in this is that obviously I can't speak for every parent in their age group, but just give some data on why they would think it's a competitive advantage. Is that if we look at data in the 1980s, the number of people attending university that year in the UK was 68,000. Now, if we compare that to now, it's something like 545,000. So that's obviously a huge difference in numbers between then and now. And I think that's what happens. I think is that a lot of parents that did go to university obviously saw the benefits of having gone to uni when they were job hunting, and potentially even the parents that didn't go to university obviously knew that that was one of the reasons maybe their colleagues got on or people got ahead of them in a job process. So they're massively pushing that now, as well as just basic things like people see it as prestigious, I think, to say that their kids have gone to university. But another really interesting fact on top of this, which is kind of along the same theme, is that so many people think that getting a 2-1 or first is some sort of given right that you're going to get a good job off the back of it. Now, the data on this is even more stark, which is that over 70% of people attending university are getting a 2-1 or better, which basically means that that's most people. So going back to the figure I just said of like 540,000 people attending higher education, well, 70% or 75% of even are getting that grade. So you're in such a competitive pool of people getting exactly the same grade as someone else. And so coupling those two facts together of how many people are now attending university, as well as how many people are getting 2-1 or better, you can see that the competitive advantage that it probably historically had just isn't the case anymore. It's just such a big pool of people having exactly the same grade. So when employees are obviously looking at CVs coming in, that is now a very, very difficult thing to differentiate you between someone else's CV. So I just think that's really important. If you didn't know that, obviously now you do, and you know that you need to get something like work experience on top of your CV, because going to university just isn't the competitive advantage it used to be. Is university the best way to learn? So you've probably seen quite a lot of business gurus or very, very famous business owners saying something along the lines of it's not worth going to university, or that university needs a huge overhaul. So the reason why they're saying this is something called the cone of learning, which was created by someone called Edgar Dale. So basically what this premise looks at is that what can you remember after 2 weeks? So what it explains is that things like reading, seeing, hearing are amongst the lowest forms of what we can remember after 2 weeks, when actually something along the lines of doing, actually we've got a high retention of what we can remember after 2 weeks. So if I asked you what you learned from a lecture 2 weeks ago, where the lecturer was just talking at you the whole time, it's probably highly likely that you don't remember much of that lecture. But if I asked you about something that you actually did 2 weeks ago, you would probably tell me a lot of information in a lot of detail about what you did. This is one of the major reasons that people talk negatively about the current education system, that's school and universities, is that, well, if it's known to be a fact that we learn more by doing, why are we consistently sticking to a theme of talking at people, getting them to read books, when obviously we know that that's not the best way for people to learn? And hopefully I would put up, as I've been speaking obviously some examples in the cone that you can see there. Just on the table itself, when you actually look at the percentages, don't take them as being literal. I did some extra research on this, and basically I think over time people started putting percentages against it just because it was more memorable data. So people will often reel off that you can only remember 10% of what you've read, but then you can remember 90% of what you do. But actually there's no data that supports that. But what you should be looking at is obviously the way that it's set up is that actually is sort of true data. You do remember more of what you do and less of what you read. So that's why, as I said, so many people have got issues with the current education system, because that's just not the best way for actually learning. And that's why ultimately when you go to work is that obviously a lot of employees see you as green, because that's how you've been learning. You haven't actually done a lot of doing. So therefore when you go to work, people will look at education in a very similar way, which is, okay, cool, like you've ticked the box of having gone to university, that's great, but you're going to have a whole other education now of actually how to learn to do things. So it's just a really important concept to understand, is that this is why a lot of people sort of poo-poo on university and education, is because of this exact model. The average graduate salary is sky high, or in the UK it's about 30k whenever you read certain studies. Now this is probably a massive bone of contention for me, is that you have to understand that with these surveys is that they're typically only going out to say the top 100 or maybe 200 companies out there to get their data, and they're obviously some of the most profitable companies out there and obviously pay some of the highest wages. So actually if you start to do a bit more digging beyond this layer, what you'll see is that that figure starts to come down and down and down and down. And ultimately, a lot of people think it's actually closer to 20k as an average across the board. What you have to remember is that different careers obviously attract different figures to them. So I can remember when I was at university is that one of my friends was an interior designer. She was on that course. I remember her coming back from a lecture and they talked about average wage going into that career, and I think it was along the lines of something like 13 to 15k per year. I remember her being devastated, and I also remember thinking like to myself, like, whoa, that is so low, because I think probably at the time for like my career it's probably something like 24 to 26k, something like that. So huge difference between the two salaries. So that's why I think it's really important to kind of ignore all of this type of information that comes out, because this is just a big admonition towards like why uni is so great, when actually when you look at the data it might not have any relevance to you whatsoever. So you must do some digging on your actual salary, and that's why I obviously did the video that I did, just explaining how to actually go about getting your own data and making sure it's relevant to you, and obviously looking at all the different career steps that are probably going to happen for you, and obviously what those different figures attached to it are. So check that video out because it goes into a lot more detail about it. But just on the point of average salaries and obviously graduate salaries, please just ignore them as data, because it's just not true. Student debt doesn't matter. So there's kind of two arguments that always come up around this point, which is one is that it's an investment in yourself, and the other is that you won't start paying your student loan back until you're earning between 17 to 20k, depending on what time you actually started university. So I've got no issues with either argument. Obviously they're completely valid. But the one thing I think to point out on this is that, and I think gets lost on so many people, and this is about actually looking after future you rather than you right now, which a lot of time is that you're potentially too young to understand that the only person that will look after future you is you right now. And quite often I think when you're particularly younger is you kind of feel like the you in 5 years or in 10 years time it isn't you at all. Like, oh, they'll deal with any mistakes you make right now. But on that point, a lot of people that I went to university with suffered with what I kind of termed myself, like this isn't something that's out there as an article, of like post-uni depression. And what I think happens is that because of like media culture and just generally how we kind of see life playing out, is that we kind of look at, we'll go to uni, we'll get a really good job that will pay us well, we'll buy a house, we'll find someone, blah, blah, blah. You get the point. Like it's kind of mapped out as to how we basically think life will work out. And I think what happens is that, obviously using university life as an example, is that by the third year, you're kind of fed up of living on the breadline, like being broke all the time, scraping by. So obviously, going back to the information we talked about, is that you're now going to earn 30k. So you kind of think, like, my life is going to change. And ultimately, unless you're living at home, if you're going to be renting somewhere, you go and get that first job, and saying like what I just said is that you might be earning now maybe 20k or less, depending on what the career is. Now you're renting, you're still on that breadline. And now you haven't got any excess income, obviously, to start saving towards getting a deposit together for a house. And then comes back in this student loan aspect where people are like, oh, it doesn't matter, as an investment in yourself. When you go to get a mortgage, obviously people like Nationwide completely take that into consideration. So when I went to get my mortgage, it was like, cool, but how much are you paying for a student loan? And therefore it comes off of what you're actually able to afford in what you're buying. So to give you a rough example is that you could be paying anywhere from you will be losing anywhere on your, say, affordability calculator from, say, 5 grand to 35 grand, depending on what you earn. So I'll put a table up over the top of me as I'm talking, but you can see that could be quite a big impact. So if you're looking to your first properties, I don't know, say it's 200,000 or 250,000, and you're potentially not able to borrow that extra 30 grand, that could be the difference between obviously getting your first home and not getting it. So I think that's a really important thing just to understand. I know, like I sort of started out, is that that's future you and you might not be concerned, but I think it's so important to understand that student debt and student loans do have an impact on future you. So when people say, oh, it's an investment in yourself, yes, they have a point, but it does have an impact. It's not just scot-free. And other people that say things like, oh, well, after a certain period, it gets wiped off. Yes, but you're still going to be paying it back over time. So that's my point, and obviously just log that as some information for you that you know about now, and obviously it will help you make decisions about which way you want to go. To round off the video, I'm going to directly respond to one of the comments that's got a few likes in one of my past videos. So I'll whack the actual question that got up on the screen, and then I'll kind of deal with it in parts because it's one of those questions that sort of got comma. So it's kind of like 4 questions or 5 questions in one. So I'll deal with it in each individual bit. Dealing with difficulty, I think this is really, really hard. I think this comes down to each individual. It's a bit like school. Obviously, sometimes you do well at some subjects and other subjects you're absolutely rubbish at. And I think uni is pretty much no different than school in this regard. So I got a 2-1, so it means I kind of found uni fine. But then you would get lecturers, and I think this is the same as school, you would get lecturers that you got on really well with, and you would kind of get better grades because you enjoyed the way that they taught. And then I remember other lecturers thinking, like, I can't stand them, I think they're terrible at teaching, and getting a really bad grade from them. Like, I remember an example where we had group work in the first year, and the idea was that I think 6 of us would form a group, and you would work together, but ultimately you would hand in your work and get graded separately. But the idea is surely that all 6 of you would get the same marks. No, all 6 of us got completely different marks, and mine was the worst. I think I got 40%, and then one of my best friends that I'm still friends with now, I think he got like 65 or 70%. I remember going to speak to the lecturer about how can this be, we've handed in the same work, and he said something along the lines of, I expected more from you, James. And I kind of thought, like, what can you do in that situation? But that's just the way it is, and I think that in that capacity, like, university is very similar to school, other than obviously a lot of subjects that you can study in university are different than school, so it is kind of starting over again. But there's not much difference in obviously the way they teach you. I mean, the major differences on university to school is just obviously independence and that side of things. So hopefully that answered that part of it. Value is a really difficult question. You have to remember that I went to university like in a different time period. So when I went, I walked out with about 10 grand's worth of debt. Some of my friends walked out with about 20 to 25 grand's worth of debt. And I remember thinking, like, holy crap, that is such a lot of money to have to pay back. It took me years to pay mine off, and it's actually, I didn't pay it off until I was telling you earlier that I was going to get my mortgage. And obviously when I was going through that process, I found that it was going to impact on how much I could borrow. So ultimately, I think I made my last payment of maybe like £1,000 or £1,500 in one hit just to get rid of it, so that it didn't have any implications on how much I could borrow. So on value, that if I was going to be getting into 50 grand's worth of debt, there's no way that I would be going to university and accruing that amount of debt. I had a quick look before filming this video that how much does it cost to go part-time, and I think for the same course that I did then, I think it was about £1,500 a year. That's wholeheartedly what I would do. So I'd probably apply for part-time university over 5 years, and then what I'd do at the same time is start whacking out my CV and a cover letter to as many companies as possible, using the same sort of tactics and processes that I've talked about in the work experience videos, just explaining my sort of current situation, that I would be going to university to study X, Y, Z, and then I'd probably even go for some of the graduate positions if they weren't for a recruiter. So obviously recruiters aren't going to be willing to listen to you on you wanting to go and sort of take a graduate position, because ultimately you'll be getting paid less and it'll mean that their fees less. But what I would do is that anyone that is looking to hire direct, whether it was like main contractors or developers, whatever it is, I would write to them just to see. I don't think there's any harm in just saying that, look, I'm going to be going to university part-time. I would be willing to sort of carry out this position for a lot less money than what you're doing. And maybe even put something along the lines of that you'll still be paying for the fees, like i.e. the university fees, so you're not putting any onus on them. And then maybe further on down the line, so say if you did get that job and you're a year or 2 years into it, maybe then talk to them about, oh, like, would they be able to fund it? Because a lot of the time companies will be willing to do it, especially once you're sort of cemented in your position and kind of part of the furniture or part of the family. So that's probably what I would do. And the other side is probably look at apprenticeships. But there's just no way that I would get into 50 grand's worth of debt. Obviously, when I'm talking about this, I'm not factoring in the social side of university. Like, obviously, I think the problem with me talking about that is that, like, I had a great experience socially, made some of the best mates that I've got out of it. But I still went to university with, there was a friend I went to university from school with. And I think after 2 months, like, she went home and she just commuted from home. Like, she didn't enjoy that aspect of it at all. Like, she loved her home friends and that side of things, and she just wasn't really prepared to integrate into university life like that. So I think it's difficult when someone says that those aspects of it, obviously it's different experiences for different people and what you get out of it. So I'm not going to factor those points in. I'm just factoring in the financial and actual work aspects of it. And as I said earlier, that you are so green from like the university side of things in what you actually learn, because obviously it's very textbook learning. So if I talk about these sort of foundation aspects as something that you would learn at university, obviously you'll learn there's different types of foundations, which is great. Like, that's a really good thing to have a foundation of knowledge in, excuse the pun. But when you go to university, like, if I just said this to you now, even when after you've learned them in university, like the day you learn it, like, cool, can you go and sort out which foundation types we need for this site? You'd obviously be completely overwhelmed in terms of how do I even do that. Like, the process is obviously, when you're at work, is a lot more process orientated. So obviously you would go and get a geotechnical survey or a soil survey, and then depending on what their practice is, that obviously sometimes they're just specialists in that area, or sometimes they're part of engineering practices, is they could probably give you a guide of what they think the foundation design would be. But more often than not, obviously you'll use that report as part of going out to get engineering quotes or structural engineering quotes. And then when you're going through that process, they'll probably start to tell you in terms of that they've looked at the reports and this is where they think the design is going. But it's not until you appoint them that ultimately they'll start to do a lot more legwork, and the designs will obviously get fleshier for you to be able to move on. What I'm trying to explain with that example is that that's why obviously companies look at university students as quite green, is because just because you understand that there's different foundation types doesn't mean you know how to actually go out and obviously get a design done, go and get quotes for it, etc. So that's why they know that what you've learned is just kind of like the basics of what is the industry, what are certain aspects of it. But actually when it comes to the doing aspect of it, they know that you're green and they're kind of expecting to train you. And that's why I think that people with work experience get preferential treatment, because I kind of think that companies look at it this in the basics that, well, at least you understand how the processes work within those companies. At least you understand those basic things of which departments you might need to go and speak to. So I think that university, as I've explained throughout this video, I think it's great. I think it's become a prerequisite for so many different things, and I think you should see it as that way, in terms of it's a box that you need to tick for an awful lot of jobs just to be able to get the job. But, and it's a big but, it's just one box now. So the way to liken this, and I'm sure any universities watching this will want to shoot me, is that imagine if you wanted to get a job for Pizza Hut doing deliveries. Well, you're going to need a driving license to be able to obviously get that job to be able to do deliveries. That's how I'm kind of seeing university these days, is that you kind of got to go to university to get an awful lot of jobs, because without it, you're just not going to get your CV looked at or just get yourself into that situation. So hopefully I've answered your questions, but obviously, as always, I'm massively happy to go backs and forwards answering any questions that you've got and helping wherever I can. Remember, as I always said, it's just one person's perspective. Like, ask this question of tons of other people. That's the whole point of Career Insights, is that it's not one person's perspective, it's multiple people's perspective. Like, you might have seen in Phil's video that he said that university and work, he saw a lot of correlation in it. But I was like, I remember listening to him when he said it, and I was like, really? Like, I didn't see a lot of correlation between the two of them at all. But then he did it part-time, so maybe that's why he saw more correlation, because he was only going once a week rather than obviously doing it full-time. So people have different perspectives. I think the other thing to point out with university is that a lot of people have similar experiences to this, which is that first year, it kind of doesn't count. And what I mean by that is that you come out of school mentality, which is that you're quite well drilled. You've been doing exams every year now for 3 years, obviously GCSEs, like AS, A levels, or whatever route you go down, but you've been doing exams regularly. So you kind of go into the first year of university with that same mentality at first. And then when you kind of work out that a lot of degrees don't count the first year towards your overall mark, is that you'll gradually start to dwindle off in actually how much you care about your grades in the first year, or how much effort you put in, or the other way, you put too much effort into your social life, and obviously things start to pitter-patter out that way. And that's very true. Like people that say that's not true, you do get foundational level information at that point, when it's important. And I do know people that failed the first year, but that's kind of what it's like. Second year, it massively steps up and you kind of see the importance, and you'll kind of have to gear yourself towards like picking out certain subjects that you're going to do well in. Because like I said, sometimes there's just lecturers that you don't get on with, or you don't learn from them as well as you do other lecturers. And then in the third year, for me, and I think a lot of people are like this, is that you kind of lose the bug for university, which is that in the third year I actually worked 2 days a week and did university 3 days a week, because that's how many days actually university was in the final year. So it's probably something to ask universities you're looking at, is that even in full time, how many days a week is it? Because that can be a big influence as well as to whether you think it's worth it or not worth it. But going back to my thoughts on final year, is that I was kind of over university. I was like, work, I was learning so much more than I was at university, so I was sort of desperate for it to be over. And obviously a lot of people do a year out in the third year, like a year in industry, and then come back. Like that would have killed me, because if obviously I'd have gone to work for a year thinking, right, this is me starting my career, to come back again like to uni would have been really, really tough. There is like catch-22 to that as well, because obviously people going to get a year in industry, a lot of the time that obviously will lead them coming out of a job. So that is a smart move for an awful lot of people, because obviously tons of companies do a year in industry as part of their sort of like as part of their like partnerships with other universities. So it is a massive opportunity. I'm just saying, for me, that would have been really, really difficult. So as I said, it's all about perspective. Chat to loads of different people, and ultimately draw your own conclusions. That's all I'll ever say, is that make sure any decisions you make are your decisions, like not my decisions. Like I kind of look at life that if you make a decision with the information you've got at the time, you won't regret that in the future, because it was the information you had now. And that's don't get bothered about making decisions, because as long as you did your homework or put some effort into actually learning about whether it was worth it, not worth it, and you collected your own thoughts, you definitely won't regret it in 5 years' time that you made that decision. So there you go, that's everything rolled up into one. You know me, I could babble on for ages. Hopefully you got some value from the video. If you did, please smash the thumbs up button. It massively helps us with the YouTube algorithm. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.